23 South Korean missionaries visited Afghanistan, spreading Christians. But on the way, their bus was blocked by a group of Taliban, so the passengers panicked. Taliban are terrorists in Afghanistan. They did evil things on behalf of Islam, even though its religion always teaches its people about peace. In Afghanistan, the government is also opposed to the Taliban. One of the Korean citizens said that they were just tourists, but the Taliban member didn't believe it because there were no tourist destinations in that area. Because of that, the Taliban arrested all the Korean citizens, taking them to their hideout. It didn't take long for the hostage-taking news to reach a special agent named Jae-ho. The government immediately told him to rush to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs office, where he was assigned to look for information about the hostage's condition. Not long after, the Taliban made a live broadcast on television announcing the kidnapping of South Korean citizens. In this broadcast, they demanded a number of ransoms, such as withdrawing all South Korean militaries in Afghanistan. Besides, they demanded the South Korean government to persuade the Afghan president to release the 23 imprisoned Taliban members. If these two demands were not fulfilled within 24 hours, then the Taliban would execute all hostages. So, this hostage-taking wasn't related to religion, but it was the Taliban's strategy to get their members out of prison. On the other hand, a special agent named Daesik has just been freed from an Afghan prison. Apparently, he was caught by Afghanistan troops while carrying out a mission. Daesik's superior reassigned him to rescue the hostages. After all, he was a person who really understood the character of the Taliban. At first, Daesik refused the order and wanted to immediately retire, but after finding out if all the hostages were civilians, he immediately received the order. In another place, the president sent several diplomats and special agents, including Jae-ho and the deputy foreign minister, to negotiate with the Taliban. So, like it or not, they had to visit Afghanistan. When they got there, they were welcomed by the embassy staff and received special guard from South Korea and United States soldiers. Not long after that, Daesik came to meet Jae-ho, because he was assigned to accompany Jae-ho while in Afghanistan. But the soldiers accused Daesik of being a Taliban ally. Fortunately, the embassy staff was able to make clear this misunderstanding. Then Daesik explained about the mission given to him. However, Jae-ho was not at all interested in working with this special agent. In fact, he immediately went without saying anything. On the way, the deputy minister asked Jae-ho's subordinates about Daesik's identity. He explained that Daesik had failed in the mission to rescue the hostages in Iraq. Besides, Daesik has a high temperament since his wife was killed by terrorists. With these considerations, Jae-ho chose to carry out this mission alone. Jae-ho and his subordinates immediately met the president of Afghanistan. There, they persuaded the president to release the 23 members of the Taliban who were imprisoned, then in return, they could free the Korean civilians. The South Korean government would also build hospitals and new roads in Afghanistan. Hearing the offer, the president of Afghanistan accepted it without hesitation. After that, Jae-ho contacted the foreign minister and informed him that the negotiations were going smoothly, so within 24 hours, the hostages would soon be sent back to Korea. While at the embassy, Daesik met Jae-ho and said that the president of Afghanistan would never release the Taliban members, especially since the conflict between the government and the Taliban was so hard to solve. Jae-ho was very surprised because Daesik knew the results of the negotiations. Because of that, Jae-ho forbade Daesik to interfere in this mission. Not long after, the Afghan government held a press conference. The president stated that they would not release the Taliban members, and the Afghan government would look for other ways to help free the Korean people, which means what Daesik said earlier was true. Hearing this news, Jae-ho and all his staff were very disappointed. Jae-ho and the deputy foreign minister intended to meet the president again to make a new agreement, but unfortunately, they were stuck in traffic, so Jae-ho asked the driver to look for an alternative way. However, they were stuck in a very bad traffic jam, and in the end, they decided to look for an online taxi. Turns out there were no online taxis in Afghanistan, so they were forced to walk. In the middle of the crowd, a member of the Taliban appeared with a bomb vest in his chest. Everyone immediately ran as far as possible, but unfortunately, they were too late. As a result, dozens of people died and others suffered serious injuries. Luckily, Ji-ho managed to survive the explosion and only suffered minor injuries. He then contacted the foreign minister and suggested withdrawing the military from Afghanistan because, according to the initial agreement, the Taliban would not do anything if South Korea and America wanted to withdraw their military troops. After that, Ji-ho treated his wounds in an ambulance, and not long after, he received information from his subordinates that the agreement would extend until tomorrow, which means he still had time to negotiate with the Taliban. Ji-ho finally decided to meet the president of Afghanistan alone. There he saw the president praying midday prayers, so he had to wait first. After that, Ji-ho immediately asked for an explanation as to why the Afghan government had violated the agreement. The president explained that he had no choice, because if he released the Taliban members from prison, they would become stronger. He thought that the Taliban were playing games with two countries. In fact, the Taliban leader wanted to ask for a ransom, but the South Korean government refused the request, even though it was the easiest way to release the hostages. Ji-ho couldn't understand his own country's decision. Finally, Ji-ho returned to the embassy's office while making a fuss and then asked the deputy minister about this matter. The deputy minister only said that the government had sent another agent to release the hostages, and the person in question was Dasik. In another place, Dasik was looking for an informant named Kasim. It was said that he was a citizen of South Korea who has lived for a long time in Afghanistan. Here, Dasik intended to use him as a translator because the informant was very fluent in Arabic. After asking the local people, Dasik finally found Kasim in a gambling place. Shortly, Kasim was willing to become a translator as long as he was paid a high price. Kasim then took Dasik to a remote village to meet the most influential tribal chief in Afghanistan. It was said that he was also very respected by the Taliban. So if they succeed in persuading the tribal chief, the Taliban would definitely release their hostages. Arriving at the village, they both immediately met with the tribal chief. With the help of Kasim, Dasik conveyed his aims that he wanted to ask for help to release the 23 South Korean citizens who were held hostage by the Taliban. However, he didn't claim to be a special agent, so he wouldn't be considered a dangerous person. As a reward, Dasik brought them a new cell phone so they could keep up to date. Not long after, Ji-ho also came to the village and wanted to know about Dasik's plans, and in the end, they both decided to work together for the safety of the hostages. The tribal chief knew their purpose, so he invited all his guests into the house. That evening, the tribal chief held a party to welcome the guests. Here, local residents invited Dasik to follow the tradition of jumping over fire. To respect the host, Dasik immediately accepted this invitation. Ji-ho and Kasim really enjoyed the party until late at night. Then in the morning, the tribal chief said that he would ask the Taliban to release the hostages, but he could only help up to that point. If there were other problems, Dasik and Ji-ho had to talk with the Taliban. Meanwhile, one of the television stations broadcasted a talk show discussing the 23 hostages who were still in Afghanistan. But the guest star even blamed the hostages who were determined to do the Christianization in a country that was in conflict. So he thought that the Taliban arrested them because of religious issues, even though it wasn't like that. Not long after, the event went viral, making the government even more confused because the news could thwart the rescue mission. Sure enough, the television broadcast had reached Afghanistan, and here, the chieftain felt that he had been lied to by Dasik and the others. As a result, he canceled his help to them. Because the mission had gone awry, Ji-ho finally contacted his superior in South Korea and asked the government to just give the Taliban a ransom, so the problem would be resolved more quickly. On the other hand, Dasik received information that the Afghan police had found the body of a South Korean citizen. Without thinking twice, he invited Ji-ho to go to the crime scene. When they got there, they immediately checked the identity of the person. The man who died was one of the hostages, and this made Ji-ho and Dasik devastated, feeling that they had failed to protect their people. After that, Dasik and Ji-ho returned to the embassy to prepare a rescue plan. At that place, they just found out that the Taliban had uploaded a video on the internet. In the video, it showed a recording of the two hostages asking to be rescued immediately. This radical group also threatened to kill the hostages again if their request was not granted. Knowing this, Dasik blamed Jae-ho's decision and the government. Hearing this, Jae-ho was furious, and he almost beat Dasik. That night, Dasik met Jae-ho at a bar to apologize. After that, he said that the only way to free the hostages was to negotiate directly with the Taliban. Here, Dasik also said that he wanted to atone for his sins in the past when he got on a rescue mission in Iraq. So in the past, Dasik had to save a hostage without violence, so he was forced to negotiate directly with Iraqi terrorists. But unfortunately, he failed and the hostage was shot dead. Dasik didn't want to repeat his failure again, so he took a broker to the embassy who could help connect him with the Taliban. He was also able to get 23 Taliban members out of prison in exchange for the Korean hostages. However, the South Korean had to pay $20 million first. After agreeing to this, the broker immediately called a Taliban member to prove that he really knew people in the group. On the phone, the Taliban member told one of the hostages to talk to Dasik and Jae-ho. In the end, they believed the broker's words and immediately prepared $20 million in cash. But to anticipate, Dasik put a tracking device in the bag. Long story short, Dasik and Jae-ho met the broker at an old building. There, Jae-ho asked for the Taliban members to be released first, and after that he would hand over the money. The broker fulfilled his promise and handed over 23 Taliban members from prison, but when Jae-ho was about to hand over the money, he was called by his boss. He was told that the broker is a fraudster who has deceived many victims. Apart from that, the prisoners who were released were not real members of the Taliban. Sure enough, the man immediately pointed a gun at Jae-ho. Dasik, who guarded outside, started to be suspicious of this situation, and because they couldn't discuss it in a good way, they finally shot each other. When Dasik was about to save his friend, he saw the broker threatening to kill Jae-ho. The broker and his men then shot their car tires, then rushed to run away. Dasik immediately chased the car and tried to snatch the money. After struggling desperately, finally Dasik managed to get the money back. Then he went to the embassy, returned the money while apologizing because he didn't know that the broker was a fraud. All the embassy staff looked angry at Dasik, but Jae-ho tried to defend him. Besides, they could take their money again. In the midst of this complicated situation, the Taliban leader suddenly contacted Jae-ho and said that their time was up. Because of that, they killed another person. The Taliban then gave additional time for 24 hours to immediately fulfill all the demands. Hearing that one of the hostages has been killed, the foreign minister immediately flies to Afghanistan, and from now on, he would lead the rescue mission. On the other side, Jae-ho went back to his hotel, feeling guilty because he couldn't save the hostage. All night, he kept thinking about the safety of the other hostages. The next day, Dasik woke up Jae-ho and told him that the South Korean and United States soldiers would hold military training near the Taliban headquarters, even though it could provoke the terrorists and could endanger the hostages. Jae-ho rushed to the embassy and asked the minister to stop the military training. But unfortunately, his request was rejected because the Korean government had decided to carry out military operations as soon as possible. The minister planned to repatriate all of the agents and the embassy staff, including Jae-ho, so as not to interfere with military operations. Moreover, Jae-ho and his friends had failed in carrying out negotiations. Jae-ho was forced to obey his superior's orders. Meanwhile, Dasik, who knew his colleague was going back to South Korea, tried to hold him. He said that as a special agent, Jae-ho still has the responsibility to release the hostages. Unfortunately, Jae-ho had no other choice and didn't know what else to do, but while packing his clothes he kept thinking about the fate of the hostages. Finally, he tried to call the Korean presidential palace, but the staff said that the president was in a meeting and couldn't take the call. Jae-ho gave up his plan, and after that, he prepared to go to the airport, hoping that a miracle would come. It seemed like God had answered his hope, because while he was waiting for the elevator, he heard the telephone in his room ring loudly. Turns out, the president called Jae-ho back to give orders for the agents to carry out negotiations directly. Jae-ho put down his intention to return to Korea. Meanwhile, the foreign minister did not agree with the plan, and he thought that the Taliban group would not be able to negotiate. Responding to this is the only way to save the hostages without endangering anyone. Because if they carry out military operations, they could kill their own people. Hearing those words, the minister was embarrassed. After that, Jae-ho sent a message to the Taliban about carrying out negotiations. Not long afterward, the Taliban responded and agreed to the negotiation plan. So, without wasting any time, the embassy staff and special agents worked together to draw up a plan in rescuing the hostages. On the other hand, Da-sik visited Kosim in prison because this informant was caught by the police while gambling. Fortunately, Da-sik was willing to help him out as long as Kasim would not gamble again and returned to being his translator. Kasim immediately accepted the offer. Long story short, the day they had been waiting for arrived. Escorted by Korean and American special forces, Jae-ho and Da-sik went to a desert. In this place, they would wait for the Taliban representatives. The negotiation process would take place at the Taliban's camp. Not long after, several Taliban members arrived. They said that their leader only allowed one negotiator and one translator to go to the camp. Therefore, Jae-ho and Kasim would go, while Da-sik and the soldiers would wait in the desert. Before starting the negotiations, Jae-ho wanted to know the condition of the hostages first, and the Taliban said that all the hostages were in good health. However, Jae-ho didn't believe what they said and wanted to see the proof directly. He asked for the two hostages to be released first, and unexpectedly, this request was immediately agreed to by the Taliban. Not long after, the Taliban freed two people in the desert. Da-sik, who saw this, rushed to help and took both of them to the hospital. After that, the Taliban commander wanted his members who were still imprisoned to be released immediately. But Jae-ho said that the South Korean government could not fulfill this request. Hearing this, the Taliban leader was angry and felt that Jae-ho was playing with him, so he ordered his men to shoot a hostage. Here, Jae-ho looked a little worried, but in the end, he managed to convince the Taliban not to kill the hostages. He then promised to persuade his superior to fulfill the Taliban's request. Unfortunately, the foreign minister would not grant the request and would instead deploy troops to attack the Taliban headquarters. Outside, Da-sik tried to prevent this plan. Then he said that Jae-ho and Kasim were still there. However, the foreign minister didn't care. Feeling that they were being played with, the Taliban's leader was furious and threatened to massacre all the hostages. Jae-ho then said that South Korea had sent warplanes to attack the headquarters, and the Taliban commander threatened to kill Jae-ho if the attack was not stopped. But unfortunately, their negotiations did not reach a conclusion, and the only way was a shootout. Luckily, the Korean government was able to attack the Taliban from all sides, and in the end, the Taliban commander looked scared and offered an easier deal. He asked for $20 million and asked South Korea to withdraw all its troops from Afghanistan. If this request was agreed, the Taliban would let the Korean people go. Jae-ho immediately agreed to the deal. He then contacted Da-sik and told him that the Taliban would release the hostages. On the other side, Da-sik immediately picked up the hostages, and those South Korean citizens looked very happy because they were finally free. Meanwhile, Jae-ho and Kasim were also taken to the desert. They were all very relieved because the rescue mission was successful. The next mission was that they had to ensure that the 21 people returned safely to South Korea. However, a new problem arose when the Taliban asked for one person as a prisoner to ensure that South Korea did not attack their base again. At this moment, Da-sik offered himself as a prisoner, even though Jae-ho prevented him. But Da-sik still insisted on doing so. Moreover, he really wanted to atone for his past sins. In the end, Jae-ho and Kasim were forced to leave their colleague. They were very grateful for Da-sik. 1 month later, Jae-ho was already in South Korea. After his successful rescue mission, he returned to work as usual. Then one day, Da-sik contacted him again, and it turned out that he had managed to escape from the Taliban prison and decided to retire as an agent. Apart from that, he also wanted to open a small business with Kasim. Knowing this, Jae-ho was very happy and couldn't wait to carry out a mission together again.